I think growing up, the most famous Christian that I knew was Ned Flanders. I think he was probably the sort of most famous Christian that I knew of. And I think in many ways he was back then the sort of stereotypical Christian. He was a good person, a nice neighbor, perhaps a little dull, but a good chap generally, a good neighbor to the Simpsons. A decent Christian stereotype, if you like. That was perhaps 30 years ago. Nowadays, perhaps Christian stereotype might be slightly more serious, slightly worse for Christians. Perhaps many people might assume Christians to be perhaps repressive in their views, perhaps bigoted in some way. Perhaps the stereotype of a Christian is a bit more serious than Ned Flanders now. In many ways, it might be harder to come out as a Christian in the workplace than come out as other things in the workplace. People may accuse us of wrongdoing. Perhaps people may have in their minds what they think a Christian is, based on perhaps media portrayals, and yet it might not be the reality. How do we respond? How do we respond when perhaps there are accusations or suggestions against Christians? Well, in many ways, that is what the passage is about this morning. That is the issue. Christians living their lives in view of a watching world that is not particularly receptive to Christian things. They might be accusing people, and yet this passage says we are to live such good lives that we silence the accusations and that actually we bring glory to God. Now that's easier said than done, isn't it? And that's why in this passage there are three things we need to know if we are to do that. And the first thing is our identity as Christians, our identity. And that is in verse 11. You look at verse 11 with me. It says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." How do Christians relate to the world around them? Well, straight away, Peter says, they are foreigners and exiles. Now, that's something we saw right the way back in 1 verse 1. The very first verse of the book says that Christians are exiles. And in 1 verse 17, it said, "Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners," here in reverent fear. This is a repeated theme. God's people, those who are following Jesus, are exiles. They are foreigners. That means that we are foreigners living in the UK. That perhaps is a slightly strange thought for many of us as we think about that, but it's true. It is the reality. This world that we live in, this world that we're to play our part in, as we're going to look about in a little bit, this world that we live in is nevertheless a world that we are in some sense a foreigner in. We are exiles in the sense that Christians are going to look different from the world around them. Our values will be different. Our lifestyle will be different. Our behavior will be different. Our identity in this world is as exiles, as foreigners, as strangers. It's a repeated theme we've seen throughout 1 Peter. It's a little bit like there's a story in the Old Testament when with Abraham and Sarah dies. Abraham is looking for somewhere to bury Sarah, and he goes to buy this plot of land, this burial plot, to bury her in. And as he's talking with the people who live in the land that he's trying to buy from, they want to sell it for a reduced price. He wants to pay the full price to honor them. And he says to them that he is a stranger and a foreigner amongst them. It's exactly the same words in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Exactly the same words. Abraham, even though he was sort of living in the land, it wasn't fully his land yet. He knew that even though he was living there, he was a stranger. He was a foreigner in the land. And that is what Christians are like. We live in this country, and yet we are foreigners. We are aliens. We are exiles in the country around us. That might be quite hard for us to get our heads around, particularly if you're British born. That is hard to get your head around. But it's true. And whilst perhaps historically in the past, the UK has been generally quite accepting of Christianity and Christian morals, perhaps that is changing. And in many ways, being an exile, being a foreigner here, is more vivid, it's more stark now than it ever has been, or perhaps it ever has been in our lifetime at least. If you hold to what the Bible says, if you're faithful biblically, you will stand out from those around you in all sorts of different ways. On gender, sexuality, marriage, holding to what the Bible says is going to make you feel pretty different, pretty odd to people in the rest of society. But it's not just those issues, lots of other issues. The Christian instinct, the Christian response for compassion, the Christian response to care for those who are perhaps refugees, the Christian instinct to offer hospitality will perhaps put us at odds with many people in society. It will set us out as different. I mean, Peter says, foreigners and exiles. That's our identity. So when it comes to the world with those things, and yet when it comes to God, verse 11 says, dear friends. I love that. The apostle writing, he says, dear friends, or beloved, close friends. We may be exiles and foreigners when it comes to related to the world, but when it comes to knowing God, we've been embraced. We've been welcomed in. The apostle, sent by Jesus himself, calls Christians dear friends. Friends with God and friends with his people. Or back in 1 verse 1 it said, to God's elect, chosen by God, welcomed by God, embraced by him. Not belonging to the world anymore, but to God. Verse 16 ends by saying, live as God's slaves. God's servants, God's slaves. How does that make you feel this morning to know that if you belong to Jesus, you're God's slave, his servant, set apart for him now, to live for him, for his agenda, for his commands, for his law, for his kingdom. We don't belong to the world anymore, Peter says. We don't belong to ourselves anymore. We belong to God, set apart as his servant. And we'll see a little bit later in the passage, Jesus set apart as God's servant, living for God's commands. Our identity now, strangers, aliens, exiles from the world, but embraced and welcomed dear friends when it comes to God, servants of God. Now that raises the question, well, what does that look like? And that takes us to our second point, which is going to be our main focus this morning, and that is our calling as Christians. How do we live out our time here as exiles, as foreigners, as strangers? Well, there's a positive and a negative. The negative is verse 11. He says, I urge you to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. We're to abstain from those sinful desires which are waging war, which are battling within us. Now we know, don't we, that the Christian life is a battle in many ways. If you're here and you're not a Christian, if you're not here, you could be watching, I suppose. What am I trying to say? If you're here and you're not a Christian, you will know that the Christian life is full of a battle. Because you know that perhaps the person sat next to you, or the person that you know who is a Christian, is not perfect. You know that. You've perhaps experienced that. If you're a Christian here, you know that you're not the end product. You know that there is a battle going on in you. The flesh and the spirit, as the New Testament calls it. On the one hand, wanting to live for God, having a new heart, new desires, wanting to follow Jesus. And yet on the other hand, the flesh, the old nature, the battle within you, the old habits that die hard. And Peter says, now that we belong to God, now that we're his servants, his slaves, we're to live for him. We're to abstain from those old ways. We're to put them off, put them away, to flee from them and to live for God now. It's a negative aspect, but there's a positive aspect, and the positive aspect is the focus of the passage. Verse 12 goes on to say, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. We are to live such good lives now, lives that are not marked by self-centeredness or by sin, but lives marked by goodness and decency and love, so that people can see those. People who aren't Christians can see that in our lives. And it silences, verse 15 says, it silences the accusations. Now, you know, perhaps you've experienced this. You know what this means. Perhaps accusations against you for what you believe that may or may not even be true. Accusations about what you believe when it comes to gender, sexuality, or whatever it is. People may speak certain things, and yet our conduct amongst people is to be good. It's to be kind. It's to be loving. It's to be gentle, hospitable, and so on. So that actually when people speak against Christians, they see there's no substance to what they're saying, that we are responding with goodness, living such good lives. And the purpose of that, he says, is ultimately what we might describe as lifestyle evangelism. Verse 12 says, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. The visitation of God, I think, is when Jesus returns. I think that's what it's saying. When Jesus returns, we have lived such good lives, lives which are honoring and pleasing to God, that it's drawn others in. It's been a witness to other people by our lifestyle, so that they have come to know Jesus for themselves. They've come to trust Jesus, and therefore will glorify God on the day that he visits us, when his Son comes back. Living a distinctive lifestyle now, so that's a witness to those around us. Now, when I was at uni in Bristol, I think I met real Christians for the first time. I say real Christians. I've met sort of people who perhaps had gone to church occasionally, but for whom really Christianity was just something they did for an hour on a Sunday. And when I went to uni, I met people who were committed followers of Jesus. They were really Christians. And there was something distinctive about them. There was something different about the way they lived, about their attitudes, about their values, and so on. There was something distinctive, and it led me to faith eventually. Some of you will know that. That will be your story as well. Some of you will have experienced that. Perhaps your story of becoming a Christian is you saw other Christians, and their lifestyle was different. Perhaps at first you thought it was weird. But there was something attractive about the way that they were living. And it encouraged you, it invited you in. That is exactly what verse 12 is saying. Living such good lives that actually ultimately people may be drawn into Jesus. Now all this assumes something. Verse 12 is making an assumption. It's making an assumption that whilst we're exiles, we are living amongst people. That we are living in relationship with other people, that we know other people, we know our neighbors, that we know our work colleagues, our friends, and so on. That we're getting stuck into our neighborhoods, and so on. Living good lives among people. We have to be among people in order for people to see our lifestyle. Christians, whilst they are exiles and foreigners, are not to withdraw from society so that they are completely unrelated to it, but to be actively involved so that people can see their lifestyle. But let's get even more practical. How do we live such good lives? Well, Peter goes on to tell us two particular ways. The first is, he says, submit to the state. Submit to the state. Verse 13 says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Verse 17 goes on to say, show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Now, there are other passages in the New Testament that talk like this. Christians are to submit themselves to the state, to human authorities, whether that's the government or the council or the regional assembly or whatever it looks like, and so on. Verse 17 says we are to honor the emperor. You don't have to be a royalist, but you do have to honor and respect the monarch. You don't have to like the government or the prime minister. I'm making no comments. You don't have to like the local MP, but you have to respect them and honor them. We are to obey the state, Peter says. Some of you will be thinking, why, but what about the loopholes? We'll think in a second about the limits to obedience to the state. But it is important that the instinct of God's people is to sit well under authority, to sit well under the authority of the state. A Christian business person should obey workplace legislation. We shouldn't break the speed limit, shouldn't watch TV without a TV license, and so on. We should comply with the law. We are commanded to do so, and we do it for the sake of witness for the Lord. Verse 13 says, for the Lord's sake. We're doing it for God, for him, to honor him. So submit to the state. What are the limits to that? Well, we should never submit to the state when it calls us to disobey God. If they're called into conflict, we obey God. Look at verse 14. It says, submit to the emperor as supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. Verse 14 is a very helpful little verse. There's a similar verse in Romans 13. This is the role of the state in many ways. There's a bit more to it than this. But verse 14 says, the role of those in authority is to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. In other words, basic law and order so that human beings can live in society and flourish. So that human beings can have a society where bad behavior is punished and good behavior is commended and encouraged, so that that is where people want to live. That's a good thing for human society. That's God's role for the state. There's a bit more to it than that, but that is the basic framework that the state, the government, is to operate in, according to the Bible. Now, we need to be clear. In Peter's day, the state was not Christian. It wasn't a Christian government in Peter's day, but nevertheless, it was generally promoting decent behavior, promoting good behavior, stopping people from doing whatever they want and encouraging people to live lives which are orderly. That was the role of the state. Now that raises, of course, an issue. Some of you are thinking, I can tell, I can see your thinking faces. You're thinking, well, what happens then when the state doesn't do that? When the state doesn't encourage good behavior? And when it sees good behavior and it calls it evil? And what the Bible would say is evil, it calls good. What do we do when the state legislates in that way? Well, that's a tricky question, isn't it? That's a hard thing. Submission to the state obviously comes only to a point. We are never to submit to the state when it calls us into conflict with God's commands, with God's law. There may be a scenario in which Christians are not to submit to the state, and in fact, not just not submit, but actively oppose the state. There's a well-worn tradition in Reformed circles called the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. It sounds very old and Reformed, doesn't it? You can read about this if you're so inclined. I can tell that none of you are. But if you wanted to be inclined that way, people like John Calvin and others have written the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. The magistrate meaning the ruler, the authority. It says, if there was a regime that was evil, and a tyrant, they often call it a tyrant, then it would be legitimate for Christians not just not to submit to it, but actually to actively oppose the government. But they should do that through a lesser magistrate, a lesser ruler. They shouldn't just have anarchy and do whatever they want and just not submit, but they should find a sort of a lesser ruler, a lesser politician, we might say, and get him or her to oppose the government. The doctrine of the sort of lesser magistrate. Do it in an orderly way, but oppose the government in that way. Verse 13, when it says submit to the state, it doesn't mean submit to the state in every possible scenario that we can imagine. There may be a time when it's legitimate to oppose the law. But we're talking about in really serious circumstances, not because you don't like the government's tax law or whatever. We are to obey the law. But in verse 14, when the state is not punishing those who do wrong and is commending wrongdoing, when the state, therefore, begins to act unlawfully in God's eyes, well, then actually it may be that there's a situation in which the government can be resisted, opposed, and not submitted to. That's the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Now, you may think, what has that got to do with life in the UK in the 21st century? What do we do, perhaps in a situation where basic Christian commands, ethics, laws are being set aside? Well, ultimately, we are to obey what God says. The apostles in Acts say we are to obey God, not humans, not people. It might get us into trouble in the future. But we are to obey God. Remember, we've seen that God's word is living and enduring, chapter 1 said. It's enduring. But of course, the great thing about one of the great things about living in the UK in the 21st century, this is a democracy. This is a democracy. The state has allowed us to make representation. You can write to your MP. You can demonstrate. You can sign a petition. You can lobby, you can try and influence, you can get involved in local politics. Perhaps that's an application from this passage for you, to get involved in politics locally. There is no conflict between doing those things, petitioning the government, speaking against the government, demonstrating, and verse 13. You can still do that in a submissive way. In fact, in this country, the state has allowed us to do those things. It's allowed us to do that. But we have to be honest. We are living in a time, perhaps a crossover time, where we need to be prepared for the future, for what might happen. Where we may have difficult decisions to make. And we need to be so immersed in the Scriptures, full of the spirit of wisdom and boldness, that we courageously make a stand for God. We must remember that our identity is exiles and God's servants. Well, that's the first way, our first calling, if that wasn't controversial enough. The second is submit to your boss. If that wasn't controversial, let's look at slavery, verse 18. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Now, I think we need to be clear. Verse 18, the slavery in the New Testament is not the transatlantic slave trade, which involved kidnapping. You can read about kidnapping in the Old Testament. It carried the death penalty. Taking it far more seriously than our society does, death penalty. In fact, in the New Testament, enslavers is mentioned along a very condemned list in 1 Timothy chapter 1. You can read about that. Slavery here is perhaps more similar to the relationship between an employer and an employee. Now, it's not exactly the same as between a modern-day employer and an employee, but it's more similar to that. And I think that's the application to us. The challenge for us here is we are in fear of God to submit ourselves to our masters. I think in this context, to our employers, to your boss. Listen to your boss. Work hard. Do what your boss says. Might be the sort of modern paraphrase version of this chapter. Now, of course, there are limits to it. Some of you, again, thinking of the limits. There are limits to submit to your boss. Perhaps sometimes you need to say no. You need to see your family. You need to come to church. But Christians are to be known for their hard work, for their diligence in the workplace, that they're willing to get stuck in, to be a team player, not being a negative influence in the office. Christians are to be known as those who are working hard. I remember once working in an office over the summer, and there were lots of floors in this big office. The floor I was working on had loads of people in it. It was not known for its hard work and efficiency, I have to say. Our job was to ring up businesses and to get their data from them and then give it to the government, so the government statistics data. And my job wasn't to write the data down. I had to ring. This is the government efficiency for you, although it does say submit to the state. But I was to ring them up, get the data, and when I would get the data, I then had to transfer them to somebody else who would write the data down. I wasn't sort of qualified enough to write the data down, but I'd sort of get it from them. And our job was to ring up businesses to get data. Now, most businesses opened at sort of 9 o'clock, but in this office, you had flexible work. So you didn't have to do 9 to 5. You could do 7 till 3, which was really helpful if you had children. I didn't have children then, but you could finish at 3. Now, some of you are thinking, if you've got to ring businesses at 9 and you start work at 7, you've got 2 hours of doing nothing. And indeed, that's what many people did. They were on their computer, on the BBC Sport website, having their breakfast at the desk and so on. This was a challenge if you were a Christian. I was a young Christian at the time. This is a challenge. What do you do? Well, I remember one person saying, speaking of somebody, I have no idea who she was talking about. And she said, oh, she's a Christian. She works really hard. Now, I have no idea who this person was. I have no idea if they'd read 1 Peter chapter 2. But they were a Christian, and in the workplace, they were known for working hard. That was a great witness. That is what Christians are to do. To work hard, to be a good employee. If you suffer in the workplace because you're a Christian, that is commendable before God. 19 and 20. If you suffer in the workplace because you're lazy or you're obnoxious, you're a bad worker, that is not commendable before God. That's not suffering for your faith. That's not persecution because you're being lazy and obnoxious. That's not a good thing. But we are to submit to our boss, to work hard as employees. 2 ways in which we practically live out our calling, live out our identity as God's people, living lives amongst the pagans, as it says. But we need to know a third thing, and that is our example. We talk about the cross. We make much of Jesus, as Kutin and Rose said. It was encouraging to hear that. We do make much of Jesus. We often talk about the cross, the gospel, Jesus' suffering, as the means of forgiveness, as the way in which God has punished Christ so that we can be forgiven. It is. It was the means in which we can be forgiven. Verse 24 is a wonderful verse we'll be thinking about as we take the Lord's Supper in a moment. And yet here, in this passage, the crucifixion is working differently. Jesus is an example to us. He's not mentioned here, first and foremost, to think about how he achieves forgiveness, but how he is an example for us to follow. We should emulate him, be like him. He suffered on the cross unjustly. He did not do wrong. He was innocent, verse 22 said, but he did not retaliate. He did not fire back. He entrusted himself to God. He didn't respond with angry words. He didn't put people in their place. He didn't fly off the handle, insist on his rights. He was the servant who suffered, endured, and did good. And we, as God's servants, are to endure and to do good. Not retaliate when people speak badly against us, not to fly off the handle, not to show them that we're not pushovers, but commit ourselves to God. Commit ourselves to a shepherd and overseer of our souls, to follow Jesus' example. In fact, the word example here in the original is hypogrammon, where we related to the word grammar. And the word that is used as example here back then was the word that was used when children would draw over shapes, letters in the alphabet. To practice their letters of the alphabet, they would perhaps get tracing paper and trace over letters. This was the word that was used. Perhaps you've done that. Our youngest one is learning to sort of do cards and makes little things for people in the church. And we try to encourage him to write his name, and we put little dots, and then he traces over the dots to write his name. That's how you learn how to do letters, isn't it? Well, that is the picture. That's the image here. We are to follow the example of Jesus. Follow his example. Be like him. Follow the lines, as it were. Follow his example of endurance, of committing himself to God and doing good in the face of opposition. That's what we are to be like. Living stones, we saw last week, have their life from the living stone. Followers of Jesus are to be like him. Suffering and then glory. It's the pattern for Jesus. It's the pattern for his people. Suffering now, and suffering not by retaliating, but by committing everything to the Lord. And as we do that, as we endure scorn and accusation, as we submit ourselves to God as his slaves first and foremost, with him dictating what we do, we follow the example of Christ, and ultimately we're living out verse 12, living such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us.